All right, welcome, Melissa, Jim, Matt. Before we get started, I wanted to mention a couple other admin comments. As everyone has seen, we have a very active chat window going. If you haven't seen yet, check out the chat and please introduce yourself there. And for the panelists, please use the question and answer panel to ask questions of the panelists. Because I got to tell you, we did a preview call yesterday with these three, and it was what an incredible group. And they're ready to address your hardest questions on any subject under the sun. I'm not kidding. Ask them anything, really. Although we did kind of couch this.
Melissa is.
Totally. I'm not a government employee anymore. You ask me anything. I'm having fun.
Um, so really, you'll find these three can handle just about any topic under the sun. Although we did advertise that this is a panel discussing the security of critical technologies and how the nation needs to address the national strategy for critical and emerging technologies. So we'll start off at least on that theme, and then we'll see where your questions and answers drive the discussion. With that, let me give my attempt at introducing these three panelists. They're all three incredibly interesting with a very deep background. Let me start with you, Matt. Matt was an Army officer, went to West Point, an extensive experience in the Army, time overseas in Germany and in Iraq. Also time with the Joint Staff doing strategy and policy and plans, including work with INDOPACOM in Hawaii. And from there, Matt, your experience took you to Department of Commerce, where you were the senior advisor for China, and also the National Security Council, where you were in a position from 1918 to I'm sorry, 2018 to 2019 to help shape some of the most critical U.S. policy regarding China. And now you are a visiting fellow with the Hoover Institution. You're also a senior advisor to Palantir. Did I get the outline of that about right, Matt?
Perfect.
Great. And Dr. Jim Miller, let me say that Jim has an extensive background in policy and strategy and how it applies to the Department of Defense, the national security community, but also how it applies in commerce and business. And Jim, you've worked in government multiple times.
I'll just say I'm the old guy in the group. Let's just get on with it.
You started when you were 16 years old with the Department of Defense as a deputy assistant secretary in 1997, I think. You also have experience in industry and with think tanks. You returned to the Department of Defense as a principal deputy undersecretary for policy, and then the undersecretary for policy for Department of Defense, which is a position that, in case any of our attendees don't know, is one that really shapes far more than just DoD policy. It shapes our national security and how our nation really has to think through some hard problems. Since 2014, you have been president of Adaptive Strategies. You do things like you are a senior fellow with Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. I wanted to say something that I don't think people know about Jim is, Jim, I think you have an incredible sense of humor. And it's really a pleasure to talk with and interact with you on any topic.
Thanks for scaring the shit out of me there, Bob.
Yeah. And Dr. Melissa Flagg, I ran into through the years, but really got to know her because of the Atlantic Council Geotech Center. And then we did a recent OODAcast where I got to interview you and dive a little bit deeper into your background. For those who haven't seen it, you have two interesting degrees, undergraduate in pharmacy, a graduate in a PhD in chemistry, which I think is perfect for what you then had to jump into in your government service, starting right as 9/11 hit, and you had to think quick on your feet and help shape government actions at Department of State, then the Office of Naval Research. You later were in a position with OSD ATNL, where you had a reputation for helping steer how the Department of Defense does research in very smart ways. And Melissa, you've done several other things. Right now, you are a senior fellow with Georgetown University Center for Security and Emerging Technology, as well as a non-resident fellow at the Geotech Center at the Atlantic Council. And Melissa, did I get that about right? The outlines there?
You got it. Everybody knows my life story. I can go home.
And I've also found, Melissa, I'm amazed at how we can talk about just about any technology topic, and you're very well versed in it. And I hope in the Q&A session here, as we get deeper into this, folks test you on my thesis and ask you some hard questions about that.
It's definitely my passion, so I'm excited about this conversation.
Cool, great. With that, let me kind of cue up the discussion, and then I wanted to ask each of you panelists for a few minutes of your thoughts on the topic. But the way we wanted to start the conversation was on the new National Strategy for Critical and Emerging Technologies. In October 2020, the administration published a list of 20 of what they consider to be critical and emerging technologies. And then what they say is a strategy for how the nation is going to need to protect this. And this is for actions in these very competitive edge fields like artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing technologies, biotechnologies, distributed ledger technologies, energy, quantum information science, communications, military, space technology, a total of 20. Well, I think it's been a long time coming. This was not just an instant strategy that appeared out of nowhere. There's been lots of discussion about the need for this. For the last 10 years, there's been a lot of discussion about the rising threats from countries like China and Russia, Iran, and North Korea. These and other closed societies have been developing well-resourced efforts to steal our technology and then use it to serve both their military and economic interests. And China especially has been adroit at doing this. And that is a key example that we're going to need to prepare for as we think through what our nation's strategy is in the future. And now more than ever, thinkers in government and industry and academia need to understand what they need to do and what our right policy should be. So with that, I would like to go in turn and ask Matt for some thoughts on this topic, and then Jim, and then Melissa, and then we'll get into some Q&A that I hope the audience and attendees will contribute to. So Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Bob. And what a pleasure to be with everybody today. Thanks for this opportunity. I think I'd start with, if we're talking about sort of this, the national strategy for critical emerging technologies, I'd make a couple of points up front. First of all, that this strategy that gets published in October, sits within a hierarchy of other national strategies that have been developed and worked on and published over the last couple of years, and that it should not necessarily be viewed in isolation, but within that wider construct, and that there are public public representations of strategies, and then there are classified representations of strategies. What you're seeing here is a public version of this, and that it tries to lay out general priorities, and makes some provides sort of high level guidance of the kinds of things to consider. If the audience will remember, we've been wrestling with critical and emerging technologies lists for years and years. Mostly had been a requirement to the Department of Defense to develop and publish those critical and emerging technologies list. And I think, I can remember as I was sort of finishing out my days on active duty at the end of the last administration. There was a lot of work under Deputy Secretary Bob Work and Steve Welby sitting at RNE to really sort of focus in and sort of capture what it is that we really care about, really from a perspective of what represents our qualitative military advantage that we could see was being diminished over time, by emerging near peers and great power competitors that were coming back onto the stage, after years of us focusing on sort of terrorist groups and rogue regimes. And so that dynamic, I think, is what should be viewed of how this strategy is published, and that the current administration, and I think there is probably broad agreement across the Hill on both sides of the aisle, that it was necessary to place this not simply in a Department of Defense national security light, but from a national level, and to connect, as the strategy lays out, to connect both that we are concerned about these technology areas for both national security and economic prosperity, and that we are going to look at this through the lens of both promoting our own ability to succeed in these areas. This is the sort of first pillar of the strategy, right? Is about a promote, and that there is also a requirement to protect, and that we need to be able to do that, and that while folks maybe in the national security space were sort of tracking and paying attention to this, the fact that this is a national strategy and being put out by the White House means that other departments and agencies that may have had some and interpreted things in slightly different perspectives, are now sort of required to sort of view it through this lens. And then the last piece I put on there, which I found quite striking, is they make it very clear that our cooperation in the world of emerging technology and critical and emerging technologies, that our cooperation in the world is primarily around our allies and partners, right? That those who we share common values with, those are the countries, those are the researchers that we should be, as a government, we should be spending our time to incentivize cooperation with. And obviously sort of the unstated thing is that there are those who are not the individuals who we're going to be cooperating with. And so I think that construct is sort of important to kind of keep in mind.
Great, thank you. Jim, some opening initial comments on this topic?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Bob. And it's great to be here with you and Madam Melissa. 5 quick points, if I can. The first, I think this national strategy is a good start. And for those who haven't seen it, it's a very quick read. As Matt suggested, it does look like the unclassified tip of a larger, potentially classified iceberg that has more content, but a very good framework thinking about 3 categories: places where the U.S. must lead or work hard to lead, places where the U.S. needs to be at least a peer, and places where either the technology is so diffused or the future of it is so uncertain that it's a risk management approach. That makes a lot of sense to me. There are areas when you look at it, you may quibble with. Growing up in Iowa, I wouldn't necessarily put agriculture tech on the top 20. I understand it's important globally. However, I think it's one that we ought to be looking to share very broadly to think about ending global hunger and so forth. But it's a good start in my view. Point 2, the strategy does lack the how, in other words, the ways. Perhaps that's in the classified version, but I want to suggest 4 ways in which the U.S. government might play a role in the how. And we can probably come back to these if you like. First is as an early investor and a smart customer for tech that's critical to U.S. operations. That includes cybersecurity, AI, resilient energy, production, storage. This is easier said than done. It requires boosting the tech savvy of people in government. But is a fundamental part. Second is as a venture capitalist of last resort. We know some folks who do that. Specifically in government, I think that needs to be a broader theme. This is high benefit, often long time frame, high risk investments in places where there are market failures, like big barriers to entry because of initial costs. Third is the tech accelerator, and you've seen DoD push on this for the last few years. As Matt mentioned, Bob Work was a big proponent, and Ash Carter certainly did a lot to get this going forward. And fourth, and relevant to what Matt said as well, is as a facilitator and a partner for on the international side, a facilitator in the sense of helping private sector companies make connections and knock down the barriers that we have, including through export control. And then the final thing I'd make on the ways, and I'll hit the other points more quickly, is US government shouldn't be picking winners and losers. Leave that to the centralized economies. It's not going to work for them. Government needs to be smart in how it enables the private sector. Point three, defense is clearly a part, the protect function for our technology IP. It needs to be focused and active. And by focused, I mean, it needs to focus in on identified crown jewels. In the Obama administration, Secretary Gates led a big effort on export control reform. And the concept was higher fences around fewer items. Well, we've got the higher fences and we've got somewhat fewer items. It should be a relatively small number of technological areas that and parts, niches within them that we really work to protect. We can't protect everything. Trying to do so is counterproductive, reduces our ability to get things done both domestically and internationally. But the second part needs to be active as well. And active means that if you steal our stuff, you're going to pay a price. Let me back up. First of all, if you try to steal our stuff, we're actually going to try to stop you before you do it in a way that this administration began to take some steps to do and was pleased to see. It also means imposing costs and significant costs on those who steal IP. You can't do that across the board. You can do it only for the important stuff. Point four, I would argue, as we think about innovation, that speed is critical, perhaps the most critical variable. It's the speed to innovate, the speed to market, and the speed to stop IP theft when it happens. That means we need some forethought about what we will protect and how we'll respond. And the strategy gives I think, a good framework for thinking about that. It also requires something that the federal government is not famous for, and that is foresight, anticipating what's next so we're not constantly surprised that China is stealing this or kicking our butts in an area such as 5G. And Bob, you and Matt have done a lot of red teaming. That's a fundamental part of that. But that's an important part of the analysis. And finally, point five, and perhaps most important and relevant to the people on the Zoom here, winning tech strategy has as its foundation a smart and aggressive human capital strategy. Everything that, from a national perspective, I think that means everything from really trying to turn up the dial in K-12 STEM education, means building out incentives for college and grad students, means creating the most attractive environment we can in the United States for immigrants with tech savvy and capabilities, and giving them opportunities to stay. As you all know, many of our entrepreneurs in the last decades have been immigrants who ended up staying and building great companies. And it means for the government to be able to play this role, to oversee a strategy, it means bringing in tech talent into government, at least on a rotational basis. And this has not been a strong point. And this is perhaps a great segue back to Melissa, because you've got a tech expert who's been in government, who's seen how things really roll, what works, what doesn't. But just a reminder that, until we have general AI, that's not military general AI. It's lowercase general artificial intelligence. People are going to be the critical driver, and indeed, we have to expect that for the long term. Technology drives economic advantage, military advantage. People drive technology, and I believe we can do better. And I'll conclude with the thought that although we have big budget deficits ahead of us, with interest rates as low as they are, long-term interest rates as low as they are, this is an area where we need to invest. If we were a company, whether a startup or a new company, we in the position that we're in as a country, we need to invest in our human capital. And so let me stop there and turn it back to Bob, and I think to Melissa.
Right. And thanks, Jim. Now, some of that, I definitely want to ask some follow-on questions as we get into this. That was extremely insightful, though, and would appreciate your views on a few other things. That Melissa, would you please give us your views on these topics?
Yes, sorry, as I fight off my cat. So 2020,
Yeah.
it's a garbage fire of a year. So I guess I tend to look at these strategies like this because I don't read anything in this strategy that's any different than most of the things I've been talking about in tech and in the military for the last 20 years. Which doesn't mean it's bad, it's good, but to me, it's sort of necessary, but deeply insufficient. We are now in a world, the global world order has fundamentally changed since 2000. Global R&D investment has tripled in 20 years. And we, as the United States, is now about 25% of that global R&D. China's another quarter. 50% of a global R&D, over $1 trillion, is other people, right? If you look at the United States and you look inward, 75% of American R&D is non-federal funded, and 90% of American R&D is performed outside of government. So the belief that government can control and protect seems foreign to me. And for me, I think about turning this national security lens inward, merging national security and domestic policy, and having a conversation where we start by shutting our federal mouths and opening our ears and talking to industry about, what do you need from us? You probably don't need a list. We could never protect the MCTOL, the Military Critical Technology List. We've never been good at keeping the list updated. I've been in charge of updating a few lists. They don't get updated. Really nice for policy people to say advanced manufacturing, but then you hand it to somebody like the DASD for research, and I'm like, I don't know if that's advanced manufacturing or not. It's negative refractive index materials. So there's a lot of complexity that rolls down from smart, well-meaning people writing large lists to where the rubber meets the road of trying to actually implement them and protect them. So I've come to believe that we actually need fewer lists and more tools. So I would go out and fund a open source consortia that was not located in the government, that the FBI has no role in, that has no law enforcement or punitive action associated with it. I would aggressively provide open source data to any American company, university, nonprofit, academic endowment, when they want to inform their own cost benefit analysis on hiring decisions, on who they're going to bring inside their firewall of IP, of who they're going to collaborate with. I wouldn't be dictating who only federally funded people can and can't deal with, and then just like finger wagging the rest of society. It really, when I was listening to your cybersecurity panel before this, and I'm really sad I don't have a unicorn hoodie right now, because like I have real envy of Bryson, that we need to actually stop blaming the users, stop blaming industry, stop blaming academia, and start like leaning into giving them tools. I would start thinking about working with Americans like alliances. I would create alliances with sectors. I would create supply chain based alliances that were both domestic and international. I would listen to people when they said, we're willing to take a risk here because we have access controls for the most important things. I also would be doing a survey of America right now, American industry, and saying, hey, we just had a major supply chain disruption. What are the actual things that disrupted your critical technologies? Because usually what we found out is I couldn't buy a washing machine, not because some critical thing was disrupted, but because I couldn't get a certain bolt, right? So what are the actual critical parts of our supply chain that make access to or use of are these high-tech things limited or usable or not usable, right? This is a complex space. But the first thing I would be doing is actually starting that conversation with Americans, as opposed to blaming them or telling them to secure or telling them to stop doing things. I just don't feel like being in that role of finger wagging works very well for the federal government in the United States. I have a lot more to say, but I think I'm going to leave it at that.
All right, well, let's get into the discussion. And I want to say, I mean, first of all, to all three of you, thanks very much for that context. And you made me think of something that I've written about before, and it's the Defense Science Board. All three of you are familiar with the Defense Science Board. I'm sure most of our attendees are also. What an institution of incredible thinkers. And there's some formal process there where the Department of Defense and others get to kind of ask questions and iterate with this Defense Science Board. And then they do studies. And there's a lot of big 40-pound brains there, like you guys have been pulled into task forces and led studies. Well, there was a study in 1987 by a guy named Fred Brooks. And Fred Brooks is one of the fathers of software engineering. He's written so many books on this. One of the most famous is The Mythical Man Month. And he's famous about writing about system engineering and software engineering and just a real brain, and still an icon in teaching to this day. Well, in this Defense Science Board study of 1987, they wrote, the Defense Science Board under him, about how the government is no longer in charge of software development. And many of these things that you mentioned, Melissa, were, they're already starting to say the trend is changing. At the time, there was still a lot of government R&D, but they saw it coming. And their conclusions were, don't write it ourselves if we don't have to. Be very careful about software development yourself, because there's a growing commercial software development industry. They just nailed it so well that every single study from the Defense Science Board afterwards on software development cites that one. And there was a congressionally mandated software study. It just reported out last year in 2019. They are citing his study from 1987, saying, yeah, look, if it exists commercially, we should buy it. It's, tap into the great strength of the American economy. Don't rewrite and develop your own programs. Well, something must change. And you three are probably in a good position to tell us, why is it that we're not learning the same lesson year after year? We're ignoring the same lesson year after year. The government is still writing its own software when it could be buying commercially its own software and taking advantage of this great R&D that Melissa just described. Why is it that the government has developers at all? Or maybe there's some need for a few developers, but why is it that the government would, want to rewrite anything or create their own capability? I swear they would create their own office automation software and recreate Microsoft Word if we would let them. Why does this keep occurring? And I guess is the basic question. I'd like to ask all three of you to comment on that. First with you, Melissa, and then Jim and Matt, please.
Well, so I do think it's a common criticism of the department. My experience with this, I'm going to use Maven as an example, right? Project Maven. Successful. I think I'm a fan. But Google kind of came in like, with all their swagger, we can solve your problem in a year. And then they're like, oh, your problem's really hard because like you don't have a digitized processes. You can't make the terrorists make things blow up like 1 billion times. So we have a lot of data. Like, oh, you have grainy input. It's not structured. We never know what it's going to look like. Like, oh, your problems are harder than Google Maps. Like, you can't force your customers to give you data in the volume you need, in the format you need all the time. Like, yeah, rare events. We've got different problems than normal people do. Secondly, you can't roll out a V1 that doesn't work 20% of the time because people die. And Google doesn't have to go to somebody's mom and say, I'm sorry, ma'am, your son or daughter's not coming home tonight because we wanted to move fast and use this off-the-shelf software, and it doesn't work 20% of the time, right? So from a military perspective, I understand that there is a different risk calculus. And I think we have been trained from babies in the government, right? Especially with the military, we care about the mission more than anything on earth. Like they give you the Kool-Aid and it is good Kool-Aid and you want to keep drinking it, right? When I was working with the Navy, they sent me out as a scientist to sea at 30 and I just became like, I love the Navy, right? I was obsessed. But that does make you really care that these kids come home, and it changes your risk calculus. Now, does that mean we shouldn't use it for personnel, for logistics, for preventive maintenance, all our HR and contracting? These are the places we should be using totally off the shelf stuff, that we should be using AI right now because they're repetitive, highly structured processes that we could force digitization on the entire infrastructure, right? But instead we want to like do sexy things like guidance packages or things that are going to kill people, and like the non-sexy stuff we don't pour the money into to just do this. So I just think like we've reversed where we're willing to put the money to do that. But we need to remember that we're always going to need qualified people to question industry, to make sure it works, and to make sure it actually takes care of our problem.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. Jim, comments on this?
Melissa's answer was terrific. I'll say maybe because I was in the policy shop predominantly, I didn't see a tremendous cadre of coders dominating the Pentagon or other departments. And when I did see some with talent, I was very glad to have them there for the reasons that Melissa indicated, including on AI, ML most recently. And also, you know, within NSA and now Cybercom, to have some people who know stuff from Shinola when it comes to how to get into a system, how to protect a system. What I also have seen recently, Bob, that I think is something to build on, is an increased movement toward not just commercial products, which has been happening for some time, especially for enterprise functions, but to open source across the board, and to the idea that the government, and this is a little scary, that the government, not the company that built software for a platform or munition or whatever, the government owns it so it can apply it again. Currently, actually, I don't think in the Department of Defense we have the expertise in most areas to be able to do that. I don't know if you could, sorry, I don't know if you can hear it, Melissa. My dog must have seen your cat. It's barking outside the door. But in any case, I think a small, really highly capable cadre for mission functions, for tailored actions, including for Cybercom, SOCOM, and NSA in particular. And then there has been some DSP work on how to stitch together unsecure systems to make more secure systems through, you know, randomization, through other steps, and diversity of suppliers that make it very difficult for somebody to get either in your supply chain or into with close insider access to be able to do something. So I will follow up with you about the premise of the question. I second Melissa's answer, and I if anything, I want a more capable cadre, and I'm okay with it having to be a relatively small group because they have the potential to have very high leverage.
Great. Matt, comments on this topic of COTS versus GOTS?
Yeah, I mean, I also think that to a certain degree we sort of, you know, exaggerate a little bit that there is an army of coders that the U.S. government is employing. I mean, there are certainly a handful inside the Department of Defense, but you know, you go anywhere else, that certainly isn't the case. So yeah, I think, you know, that's one thing. The other I would kind of go back to is so we talked a little bit about kind of the how you would do these things, right? And to me that gets down to sort of you know, tools and authorities that are available, right? And you know, Jim did a great job of laying out, you know, another additional 5 that kind of, you know, he would you know recommend adding. But I think it's good to keep in mind that you know, there are existing authorities and tools that different departments and agencies have that a, a glossy document like this is supposed to provide them guidance about how they employ their tools and authorities, right? So Melissa brought up the idea of surveying the U.S. about what the supply chain is and the vulnerabilities they had. Well, that is an excellent idea, and it actually resides within the Bureau of Economic Analysis inside the Department of Commerce under the International Investment Survey Act of 1976 that gives the Department of Commerce the authority to demand and actually require U.S. companies that conduct international trade to answer specific surveys. And to date, unfortunately, the department doesn't really use that authority. They have it, right? It doesn't belong to the Department of Defense, but it belongs to a different department. And they currently don't really use it to figure out what our vulnerabilities are, right? Now they certainly could. And I think that you could read, and if you were in a new administration, an incoming Secretary of Commerce, or the you're the new Assistant Secretary heading the Bureau of Economic Analysis, right? You could interpret a strategy like this as an imperative for you to use your authorities that already exist, that you already have been Senate confirmed in order to use to follow this path, right? This isn't a laundry list of every action every individual should take, but that they should read things like this as guidance to professionals who have been entrusted with authorities to be able to go execute. And I think, to me, those are the kinds of things we should be expecting of our leaders to do. And that obviously they should be in, reaching out to industry and figuring out what those sorts of things are. And there's nothing, I think, that precludes them from doing any of that work in a document like this. And so to me, it is much more of a guidance on how to use your own authorities, as opposed to what we would think of a strategy as being as some sort of detailed plan, that will unfold over phases where we are very specific about the actions that everybody has to take. That's just not how we operate as a government. And I think the other issue is that we also forget that the executive branch doesn't actually do resourcing, right? We have to go back to Congress for that. And that requires a guidance and then the putting together of budgets that allow you to go make those arguments, that the executive branch just can't lay those things out in that detail.
Great, thanks.
Hey, can I interject, Bob, see if we have a concurrence here? That the federal government or any government is not going to solve this problem fundamentally. One of the most important things it can do is do no harm, and reduce the areas where it's already doing harm by doing stupid stuff, in my view, including imposing incredible burdens, in some cases through paperwork, and on small businesses. In other cases, by so severely restricting the ability of not just aerospace and defense companies, but a wide range of companies to have serious conversations on tech with the international partners and allies that has any possible application. I think we've got to open it up. We've got to take risk in working more with our allies and partners and facilitating relationships between companies in the private sector. We'll take a little bit of risk. The objective is to accelerate the pace of innovation for us. That's something that our system can do better than the Russian/Soviet system or the Chinese CCP. And it's an area of, it ought to be an area of advantage that we build on and be careful that we don't denigrate by an over effort on centralized planning. My guess is we all agree. I just want to do a gut check on that one.
I just want to throw out one complicating aspect of this that I find difficult in the current conversation of trying to parse people into friends and enemies. Is the vast majority of the world doesn't fall into either of those categories most of the time. They're partners in some areas, they're not in others, and many of those nations are really large R&D funders. So is India an ally? I mean, we're good friends with India. We do a lot of business with India. India buys a lot of Russian stuff. I don't know, are we allies?
But India is
the-
not a semiconductor producer, right?
I
So,
mean,
I mean, there's really only 5 or 6 countries in the world that are significant semiconductor producers.
but I didn't talk
Which
about
are
semiconductors.
allies. So,
I was talking about a more general thing because they have 20 topics, not a semiconductor list. And if you're going to talk about 20 topics, some of these topics, India's a big player. And so I just want to throw out that I'm not saying it's good or bad. I said I believed at the beginning it was necessary but insufficient. And I still believe that quite strongly. And I don't actually think the government should be spending as much time deciding what's right and telling everybody in industry what to do. I think they've got to start by listening a little bit as well and letting industry guide some of the walls. Because I do agree, Jim, with almost everything you said about higher walls around fewer things. It was right when Bob Gates said it. It's still right. We've never done it because we don't like risk. So we're willing to build the higher wall, but we're not willing to take some of them down.
Guys, we've almost busted our schedule. I want to get one more question in and see if I can get your thoughts on this. And briefly, have you seen this book or read this book, Fooled by Randomness by Nassim Nicholas Taleb? You know, he talks about the human nature. We look at these complex things and we want to see patterns. We look back in history and we think, oh, that was simple cause and effect. And after reading that book, I'm thinking my belief about our relationship with China may have been a bit too naive and simplistic. And so I want you guys to tell me if it was, because I used to think, gosh, we pulled them into the World Trade Organization. We were so nice to them. We all believed they would liberalize and become like us. And we wanted our adversary to do things our way, and they didn't. How foolish of us. And I think maybe that was kind of a naive statement on or belief that I had. I was fooled by randomness. It wasn't so simple. What are your views on the relationship with China and what it means for our future in 3 minutes or less? Melissa, was I fooled by randomness?
I think it's insane to think a nation that's thousands of years old is just going to like hop along behind us and want to be like us. So I think it was pretty naive, and I think this was pretty predictable.
Jim, what are your views?
It's a tough question, actually. I think it was not an unreasonable policy 20 years ago, 30 years ago, to try to lift China up and to assist it to come into the industrial age and then into the modern age of technology. I think we were slow to recognize that it was growing to the point that it had. There were those, including in particular a team under Andy Marshall, who had highlighted this issue going back 20 years plus. And while many people in the national security sector took that seriously, as we got focused on Afghanistan and Iraq, the investments didn't go the direction that they would otherwise have to posture ourselves better to deter both gray zone adventurism and coercion or attack by China. So, I was looking back at my time in government and thinking, man, when we rebalanced to the Asia Pacific in the Obama administration, it was significantly to put more military in that theater and to serve as a deterrent and to build our cooperation with other states. So at that time, we had sort of seen the writing on the wall, and we're still looking for avenues of cooperation with Xi Jinping and CCP. I think what's proved out is that it was possible. I don't think it was a crazy strategy, but I think that strategy has failed and that it needed to be adapted. And this administration focus on great power competition, with a big issue about how it's done, I think is accepted by most people of both parties. Sorry to be so long.
Great, thanks. Matt, comments on this?
Yeah, I think your opponent in any execution of a strategy always gets a vote. So, I think that the nearly 3-decade strategic approach that the U.S. had adopted, really after the end of the Cold War, where our original relationship with the PRC was really based upon a Cold War concept of using them as a hedge against the Soviet Union. The decision after Tiananmen and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union to essentially embrace, Deng Xiaoping's concepts of reform and opening, and to bring the PRC into a broader economic system, with the idea that as they developed economically, that would then sort of automatically lead to political liberalization. That was actually a well-founded strategic approach that the United States had used in countless time. I mean, it's certainly the approach we used with Japan and Germany after the Second World War. We used it with Spain and Italy. It's certainly the approach we used with South Korea and Taiwan. In the 1980s, that were both authoritarian regimes that we brought into the international system, and they liberalized politically. It's certainly what we did with the countries of Eastern Europe. It's certainly what we tried to do with the former republics of the Soviet Union. So it was not right. There's a reason why the United States approached the problem that way, right? It was not insane to think it would work because it had worked before.
Right.
The reality is that we found ourselves in a position, I think, relatively quickly, that just in the last few years, that our expectations of what would happen were not reaching reality, and we actually have changed relatively quickly, right? So, it was really not until sort of 14 and 15 that we began to really observe that the PRC was not heading in the direction that we wanted them to sort of go, and towards an idea of convergence. And really within 24 months, the United States was already sort of moving in a very different direction, right? So, I'm not sure what faster would have looked like, right? Given that this is the first and second largest economies in the world, and there's an awful lot of interaction, I'm not sure what necessarily faster would have looked. I think we did about as best as we could.
Well, thanks, Matt. And Matt, Jim, Melissa, we busted our schedule, but I tell you, we left so many open questions that we were talking about. I would love to follow up with each of you by email, if that's okay, and maybe produce another piece for our OODAloop.com site, because there's so many things we need to talk about, like how do we help small businesses protect themselves? How do we impact and change our nation's K through 12 education to produce more strategists? How do we inform DoD strategy going forward? So thanks, panel, for all this. And I'll be in touch and follow up with more questions. So really appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob.
Great pleasure. Take care.
Thanks for listening to this OODA Loop production. For the latest analysis on cybersecurity, technology, and global risks, please visit www.oodaloop.com.